She asked me to help her kill her son. The words themselves, delivered by Sarah Vance, a woman who rarely missed a Sunday Mass, a woman whose life had been a testament to unwavering devotion, echoed not just in the sterile beeping corridor of the intensive care unit, but deep within the quiet chambers of my own priestly heart. They hung in the air, heavy and incongruous, like a forgotten shroud in a brightly lit, aseptic operating theater. "Father Michael," she'd pleaded, her voice a reedy whisper scraped raw by a grief that had gnawed at her for days, perhaps weeks. "I need you to convince Mark to let Leo go. Let Leo go." The phrase, so benign in other contexts, here twisted into something monstrous. It meant to unplug the machines, to cease the rhythmic hiss and thrum of the ventilator, to allow the monitors to fall silent, to actively, definitively end his life. My mind, usually a wellspring of pastoral wisdom and comforting scripture, stood frozen, caught in a rapid, horrifying theological calculus. The metallic tang of antiseptic, usually a familiar if unpleasant aroma in these halls of pain and fragile hope, now burned my nostrils, sharp and acrid, mirroring the caustic shock that coursed through my soul. I stood there, a man of God, accustomed to offering solace, to guiding souls towards light, to affirming the sanctity of life in every breath, every heartbeat. Before me, this pillar of our parish, a woman whose hands had meticulously polished the altar brass, whose voice had soared in the choir, whose earnest prayers had filled our chapel every Tuesday morning, was now asking her priest, her spiritual guide, to aid in what felt like an act of profound theological betrayal. It was an assault on everything I understood about divine will, about human suffering, and about the solemn promise of life itself. The very foundation of my calling, built on compassion and preservation, felt suddenly unstable beneath my feet. The corridor itself was a landscape of stark, clinical efficiency. Fluorescent lights cast a relentless, shadowless glow on the polished linoleum floor, reflecting the hurried footsteps of nurses and doctors, each click and scuff a hollow echo of life rushing on. The air, despite the heavy filtration, still carried the faint, unsettling scent of sickness, of fear, of something vital being held precariously in the balance. Through the partially drawn curtain of a bay just a few feet away, I could discern the form of her husband, Mark. He stood rigid, a statue carved not from stone but from furious denial and desperate prayer, his head bowed, his hands clasped so tightly around his worn rosary beads that his knuckles were bone white, stark against his bloodless skin. I knew, without seeing his face, that his eyes would be closed, perhaps squeezed shut against the unbearable reality, his lips moving in silent supplication, a bulwark of faith erected against the tide of despair. Their only child, Leo, lay just beyond that threshold, behind the pale, thin fabric of the curtain, caught in a terrible limbo, between the vibrant, boisterous life he had once inhabited and the absolute, irreversible cessation that awaited him. He was the silent, unconscious fulcrum upon which this agonizing debate balanced, the beloved son for whom his parents now championed two diametrically opposed visions of love, mercy, and God's intervention. The contradiction was staggering, almost physically painful. Here stood the Vances, a family of profound, unquestioning faith, their devotion a benchmark for many in our parish, now utterly shattered by a tragedy of their son's own making. The knowledge that Leo's reckless choices had led him to this sterile bed added another agonizing layer to their grief, a bitter tang of what-ifs and unspoken accusations that must have poisoned their waking hours. And now, they were not just grieving, they were debating the very definition of life, of death, of God's inscrutable will, as though these eternal mysteries could be reduced to a choice on a medical consent form. My usual calm, the steady, unwavering pastoral certainty that had always guided me through the darkest moments of my parishioners' lives, dissolved like sugar in hot water. Normally I would have a script, a passage of scripture, a gentle word of comfort ready. But here the words caught in my throat, tangled in the sheer enormity of the request, the profound chasm between these two loving parents, and the unspeakable reality of their son's condition. My spiritual compass spun wildly, unable to find true north in this tempest of grief and moral ambiguity. The weight of my stole, usually a symbol of comfort and authority, felt impossibly heavy on my shoulders, a sudden crushing burden. I knew then, with a chilling clarity that pierced through the confusion, that what I was about to witness, what I was about to become entangled in, would challenge everything I believed. It would test the limits of my understanding of God's mercy, the boundaries of His divine plan, and the true meaning of human suffering. Everything I had been taught in seminary, every homily I had ever delivered, every prayer I had ever offered, felt suddenly insufficient, mere whispers against the roaring silence of Leo's inert form. It began there, In that moment of impossible contradiction, on that cold, beeping corridor leading inexorably towards an impossible breath that would, in time, turn the entire ICU silent, I moved then, from the liminal space of the corridor, where the harsh hospital lights felt almost accusatory, into the hushed sanctuary of Leo's room. It was a small, curtained-off enclosure within the larger, bustling intensive care unit, and stepping across its threshold felt like entering a different dimension altogether. The sounds of the ward, the distant clatter of carts, the hushed conversations, the ubiquitous, insistent beeping, seemed to recede, replaced by the more intimate, rhythmic symphony of machines keeping one young life suspended. The air here was thicker, saturated not just with the familiar tang of antiseptic, but with something else less tangible, a palpable sorrow, a desperate hope, and the lingering scent of unspilled tears. My breath caught, not from the physical transition, but from the sudden, stark reality of the scene that unfolded before me. The sterile white walls, the gleaming stainless steel of the medical apparatus, the fluorescent lights that cast no shadows of comfort, all conspired to create an environment utterly devoid of warmth, a stark contrast to the vibrant young man Leo had once been, and certainly to the warmth of the home from which his parents had come. Leo lay at the center of it all, a silent, still figure dwarfed by the intricate web of modern medicine sustaining him. He was barely 20, yet the vibrancy of youth had been stolen, replaced by a profound, almost ancient stillness. His skin, usually tanned from countless summers spent on the baseball field or by the lake, was now a pale, translucent canvas. His hair, once the unruly mop of sandy blonde, lay flattened and matted against the pillow. His eyes, usually alight with a youthful mischief and an adventurous spirit that had, tragically, led him to this very place, were now closed, the lids fragile and papery, hiding whatever dreams or darkness lay within. A translucent tube snaked from his mouth, disappearing into the depths of a ventilator that stood beside the bed, its rhythmic hiss-sigh, a constant mechanical breath mimicking life. Another array of wires sprouted from his chest, vanishing beneath the sheets, their paths traced on the monitors above, displaying a flickering green line, his heartbeat, strong and steady, but entirely independent of his own will. Intravenous lines spiderwebbed from his arm, dripping clear fluids into his veins, a constant replenishment of what his own body could no longer process. He was a masterpiece of biological engineering, meticulously maintained, yet utterly, devastatingly inert. He was there, and yet he was not. My gaze lingered on his hands, lying open and vulnerable on the pristine white sheet. These were hands that had once gripped a baseball bat with confident strength, had sketched intricate designs in his engineering notebooks, had, I remembered fondly, once clumsily helped me arrange hymnals after Mass when he was an altar server. Now they were just hands, pale and still, devoid of purpose or movement. This then was the boy whose life, whose very soul, hung in such precarious balance, whose fate was now the epicenter of an agonizing parental war. Sarah and Mark stood on opposite sides of the bed, creating an invisible yet deeply felt chasm between them. Sarah, her face a topography of exhaustion and grief, turned to me, her eyes meeting mine with a plea I understood instantly. Mark remained rooted to his spot, his back to me for a moment, his gaze fixed on his son, as if his sheer force of will could somehow reawaken the life within. "Father Michael," Sarah began, her voice a low, steady murmur, astonishingly calm despite the storm raging within her. It was the voice of a woman who had spent countless hours rehearsing these words, steeling herself for this moment. "Thank you for coming." I simply nodded, my own throat tight, finding no words adequate for the enormity of the situation. My role, I knew, was not to advise immediately, but to bear witness, to listen, to enter into their suffering, however raw and discomforting it might be. This was the priest's sacred duty, to be present in the deepest valleys of human experience. I've been trying to explain to Mark," she continued, her gaze flickering briefly to her husband's rigid back, "that this isn't living. Not really. Dr. Sharma, she's the neurologist. She's been very clear. There's no brain activity. Zero. It's just the machines now." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, the clinical pronouncement a fragile dam against a flood of emotion. She took a slow, deliberate breath, as if gathering the remnants of her resolve. "For me," she explained, her voice now softer, more fragile, "this isn't giving up. It's an act of mercy, Father. For Leo. To keep him like this, a body breathing, a heart beating, but with no him inside. It feels cruel. It feels like we're just holding on to a shadow, prolonging something that God has already called to an end." Her understanding of faith, I recognized, was deeply rooted in compassion, in the release from suffering. She saw this not as a betrayal of life, but as an ultimate act of love, releasing her son's soul from what she perceived as a broken, uninhabitable vessel. Her exhausted faith was not diminished, but refined, honed by an unbearable reality into a sharp, painful clarity. She was trying to align her will with what she believed was God's merciful will, even if that meant accepting a reality so devastating. The notion of releasing a soul from a broken vessel, it echoed ancient wisdom, a profound acceptance of the perishable nature of the body and the eternal nature of the spirit. She believed she was facilitating Leo's final journey, not terminating his life. Mark finally turned, his face etched with a fury that seemed to defy the quiet solemnity of the room. His eyes, usually kind and steady, were now bloodshot and burning with a fierce, almost desperate light. In his hand, clutched so tightly his knuckles were white bone against taut skin, was his well-worn rosary. The beads, smooth with years of prayer, seemed to dig into his palm, a physical manifestation of his unyielding grip on hope. "Mercy," he rasped, the word sharp, slicing through the air. "Sarah, what kind of mercy is this? To just give up? To unplug him? To tell God, thank you, but we're done here?" He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound disbelief and rejection. "That's not mercy, Father," he appealed to me directly, his voice lowering but retaining its edge of steel. "That's abandonment. That's a profound betrayal." For Mark, the definition of life was simpler, more absolute. As long as the machines worked, as long as a heartbeat, however mechanically induced, there was life. And where there was life, however faint, there was hope. His faith, unlike Sarah's weary acceptance, was defiant, rooted in the omnipotence of God. He saw the very act of maintaining Leo's physical existence, even artificially, as a declaration of faith, a refusal to concede defeat to the crushing weight of medical prognosis. "As long as there's a flicker, Father," Mark insisted, his voice breaking slightly but his resolve unbroken. "A single, tiny flicker. God can still turn it into a flame. Don't you believe that? Our God is a God of miracles. He doesn't just abandon us when things get hard. He waits for us to show our faith. He waits for us to trust in His power." He gazed at Leo, and for a fleeting moment, I saw not fury, but an unbearable tenderness, a father's unshakable love for his son. It was a love that refused to surrender, a love that clung to the smallest possibility of divine intervention. His logic was rooted in centuries of spiritual understanding. God is all-powerful, and His will can supersede any earthly limitation, any scientific certainty. To disconnect the machines would be, in his eyes, an act of preemptive despair, a denial of God's capacity to perform the impossible. He believed in a God who could breathe life into dust, who could raise the dead, who could undoubtedly reignite a flicker into a full blazing flame. I stood there, a silent conduit for their warring grief, absorbing the force of their diametrically opposed perspectives. They were both devout Catholics, both heartbroken parents, both clinging to their faith, yet their interpretations of God's will and their responsibilities as parents could not have been more divergent. Sarah sought peace through acceptance and release, seeing it as an act of compassionate surrender. Mark demanded life through unwavering faith and persistent hope, seeing any alternative as a capitulation to despair. My role, I realized with a heavy heart, was not to judge which parent was more right in their suffering. Such a judgment would be both arrogant and cruel. Instead, my calling in that stark, beeping room was to shepherd them through this valley of shadows, to walk alongside them even as their paths diverged into a terrifying chasm. It was a place where faith and reason were at war, where the profound mysteries of life and death intersected with the cold, hard realities of medical science. I understood that my priesthood demanded of me more than theological answers. It demanded presence, empathy, and a willingness to simply be, even when silence was the only response. I had to create a space, however small, for them both to express their agonizing truths, to scream their pain, to articulate their fractured faith without fear of condemnation. For how could I, a mere man, presume to tell these parents how to grieve, how to hope, how to define the sacred boundary between life and death when their son lay before them, breathing but not living, present but absent? The weight of their choices, the intensity of their love, the depth of their despair, it all pressed down on me, heavy and encompassing. The air thickened further, charged with unspoken prayers and unshed tears. This was not a moment for grand pronouncements or theological debates. This was a moment for deep listening, for bearing witness to the raw, unvarnished agony of souls grappling with the unthinkable. This was a moment to simply be with them, in the heart of their storm, and to trust that even in this darkest of hours, God's grace, however inscrutable, was present, waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the path ahead for the Vance family, and indeed for my own understanding of faith, would be anything but ordinary. It would be a journey into the very heart of mystery, where human will clashed with divine possibility. The sterile hum of the ICU corridor, with its relentless, indifferent chorus of beeps and sighs, had become an unwelcome constant in my days. Yet, in that moment, as Mark's and Sarah's faces, etched with a grief so profound it seemed to pull at the very air around them, swam before me, the noise faded to a distant murmur. The raw, unvarnished agony of souls grappling with the unthinkable had pressed down on me, heavy and encompassing, leaving me breathless in its wake. The air, thick with unspoken prayers and unshed tears, still clung to my cassock. This was not a moment for grand pronouncements or theological debates, but for deep listening, for bearing witness, for simply being with them in the heart of their storm, trusting that even in this darkest of hours, God's grace, however inscrutable, was present, waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the path ahead for the Vance family, and indeed for my own understanding of faith, would be anything but ordinary. It would be a journey into the very heart of mystery, where human will clashed with divine possibility. I led them as gently as one might guide a blind traveler over treacherous ground, away from the clinical harshness of Leo's room, and into the quiet sanctuary of the hospital chapel. It was a small space, tucked away on a lower floor, a deliberate counterpoint to the relentless science above. Here the light was muted, softened by an amateurishly rendered stained glass depiction of the Good Shepherd, casting pools of bruised amethyst and weary gold onto the worn kneeler. The air smelled of old wood, dust, and a faint lingering whisper of incense from some forgotten benediction. No frantic beeping, no urgent voices, only the hushed, almost reverent stillness that invites confession, reflection, and the arduous work of remembrance. We sat in the front pew, Sarah between Mark and me, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white, trembling. Mark stared fixedly at the crucifix above the altar, his jaw tight, his gaze as unyielding as stone. I didn't press them to speak. Sometimes the most profound acts of ministry are simply to be present, a silent anchor in a churning sea. But I knew too that before we could ever hope to navigate the path forward, we first had to acknowledge the ghosts that walked among us, the ghost of the boy Leo once was, and the ghost of the young man he had become. It's important sometimes, I began, my voice a low rumble, breaking the quiet with utmost care, to allow ourselves to remember not just the pain of the present, but the fullness of a life, to trace the lines of memory, even the difficult ones, to understand how we arrived at this moment. God, after all, knows our whole story, not just a chapter. Sarah nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. Mark remained still, but a muscle in his cheek twitched. It was an invitation, gently offered, to unburden themselves of the story that had brought them here, to lay bare the layers of love, hope, disappointment, and ultimately despair that had culminated in Leo's broken body. And as they began to speak, haltingly at first, then with a growing urgency, a portrait emerged not just of Leo but of their family's journey through faith and fracture. Leo, how many times had I seen him as a boy, a mischievous glint in his eye, serving as an altar boy, his white all pristine, his movement surprisingly graceful for a 10-year-old. He had been, in their words, a sunshine boy, bright, inquisitive, always asking questions in Sunday school, eager to understand the mysteries of God and the saints. Sarah remembered his unwavering faith as a child, how he would pray for lost pets, for sick friends, for peace in the world, with a pure, unshakable conviction. He used to tell me, she murmured, her voice thick with tears, that God heard every single prayer, no matter how small. He said God just needed to know we were talking to him. Mark, a man of quiet strength, softened visibly at this memory. He was always a leader even then, he added, his voice raspy. The other boys looked up to him. He organized our parish youth group's food drives, always the first to volunteer for any task, no matter how dirty or thankless. He had such a generous heart, a real zeal for life, and for his faith. They painted a picture of a childhood steeped in the rhythms of the church, weekly mass, CCD classes, youth retreats, volunteering in the community. Leo was not just present, he was engaged, a testament to the Vance's own devout example. He was an honor student, a promising athlete, a son who brought them immense pride and joy. They spoke of a particular Christmas Eve when Leo, then 15, had chosen to spend the entire night volunteering at a homeless shelter, serving hot meals, rather than opening presents first thing in the morning. He said he felt closer to the true meaning of Christmas that way. Sarah recounted, a wistful smile playing on her lips, a stark contrast to the hollow grief in her eyes. That was Leo, always seeing beyond himself, always searching for something deeper. But as Leo transitioned from boy to young man, a subtle shift began. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic rebellion, but a slow, almost imperceptible drift, like a ship loosening its moorings in a quiet harbor. The first signs were small: skipping a youth group meeting for a friend's party, expressing skepticism during a homily, questions about church teachings that felt less like innocent inquiry and more like pointed challenge. At first, Mark and Sarah attributed it to the natural questioning phase of adolescence, a healthy exploration of personal faith. They encouraged dialogue, tried to answer his queries with patience and understanding. He started hanging out with a different crowd in high school, Mark recounted, his gaze now fixed on some painful point in the past. Good kids mostly, but they didn't have the same compass, you know? They weren't bad influences, not outright, but they just lived differently, without that anchor. And Leo started to emulate that. The youth retreats became less appealing. Sunday Mass became a chore, then an argument. His grades, once stellar, began to slip. The passion he once had for service waned, replaced by a growing fascination with the immediate, the superficial, the fleeting thrills of his peers. He started talking about wanting to experience real life, complaining that the church was too restrictive, too old-fashioned, out of touch. His youthful idealism, once directed towards God, began to redirect itself towards a secular vision of freedom and self-discovery, often indistinguishable from self-indulgence. "We tried, Father," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "Oh, how we tried. We talked, we pleaded, we prayed. We grounded him. We took away privileges. We tried to be understanding, to meet him where he was. But it was like watching him slip through our fingers. The more we tried to pull him back, the more he seemed to push away." The quiet resentment began to fester. They saw the son they knew, the son they had raised in faith, slowly being eclipsed by a stranger. He started pushing boundaries, small acts of defiance escalating into more significant ones. There were arguments over curfews, over his choice of friends, over his increasingly cavalier attitude towards his responsibilities. The warmth and openness that had defined their family dynamic began to cool, replaced by a guarded tension, an unspoken chasm growing wider with each passing month. "He started drinking," Mark stated flatly, the words like stones dropping into a deep well. "Nothing serious at first, just what high school kids do," we told ourselves. But it got more. He'd come home late, smelling of stale beer. His eyes would be just a little too bright, his laugh a little too loud. We found bottles hidden in his room. We tried interventions, therapy. Nothing seemed to stick. It was like he was caught in a current, and we were standing on the shore, watching him get pulled out to sea. The last 2 years had been particularly difficult. Leo, now 20, had dropped out of college after a year, declared his independence, and moved into a small shared apartment. His calls home became sporadic, his visits even rarer. He worked odd jobs, drifted from one interest to another, a young man untethered, driven by an almost desperate need for freedom, for sensation. The parents' grief over the loss of their sunshine boy was compounded by a deep, unspoken anger at the choices the reckless young man was making. They mourned not only the son lying silent in the ICU, but the son they had lost long before the crash. And then, the accident. The details, as they recounted them, were a brutal litany of choices made and consequences reaped. A late night, a party, too much alcohol, the thrill of speed on an empty country road, a challenge from friends, a curve taken too fast, the sickening crunch of metal, the shattering glass, the immediate devastating silence that followed. He was found, barely clinging to life, trapped in the twisted wreckage of his car. No one else was seriously hurt, a small mercy. But Leo had absorbed the full, crushing impact. The doctors had been starkly clear, their words stripped of all euphemism. Massive head trauma, irreversible brain damage, injuries incompatible with life. It was his fault. His terrible, catastrophic mistake. "And the guilt, Father," Sarah sobbed, finally breaking, leaning forward, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with the force of her grief. "The guilt is crushing me. What did we do wrong? Where did we fail him? Was it too much church? Not enough? Were we too strict? Too permissive? Every decision we ever made, every word we ever spoke to him, it all replays in my head. 1,000 what-ifs that scream at me day and night." Mark finally moved, his hand reaching out, hovering over Sarah's back, unable to quite touch her, as if afraid his own pain would contaminate hers. "I told him, Father," he said, his voice raw, laced with a barely suppressed fury. "I warned him. About the drinking, about the speed, about the company he was keeping. I told him he was playing with fire. And now look." He gestured vaguely, not towards the chapel door, but towards the unseen antiseptic world above, where his son lay. His anger, I realized, was not just at Leo, but at himself, at the circumstances, at a God who seemed to have allowed this to happen. It was the anger of a protective father who had watched his son veer off course, powerless to stop the inevitable collision. And in that anger was the terrifying, unspoken question. Was this a punishment? A divine reckoning for Leo's straying, for their own perceived failures as parents? Or was it, as some mystics suggest, a twisted, incomprehensible path to some unknowable grace? A harsh crucible intended to refine, to purify, to bring back a soul that had wandered too far. I looked from Sarah's bowed, tear-soaked head to Mark's rigid, defiant posture. Here were two parents, both devout, both deeply loving, both utterly broken, grappling with the most agonizing of theological questions at the bedside of their dying son. Sarah, in her exhaustion, sought release, seeing mercy in letting go, perhaps hoping to free Leo's soul from the broken vessel that had led him astray. Mark, in his desperation, clung to life, to hope, perhaps feeling that to give up would be to abandon the good boy he still believed was somewhere inside, to admit defeat in a spiritual battle he was unwilling to lose. Their faith, once a shared bedrock, was now splintered, each facing God's will through a different lens of pain. The son they had loved so fiercely, the one who once believed God heard every prayer, now lay silent, his choices having led him to this precipice. And the chasm between their broken faith and any flicker of hope for divine intervention felt wider and deeper than ever before. This wasn't just about life or death. It was about the very meaning of suffering, the nature of forgiveness, and the silent, terrifying question of whether God, in His infinite wisdom, sometimes allows us to fall so utterly, so completely, that only a miracle can lift us back up. The chasm between their broken faith and any flicker of hope for divine intervention felt wider and deeper than ever before, a raw wound in the spiritual landscape of their lives. This wasn't just about life or death. It was about the very meaning of suffering, the nature of forgiveness, and the silent, terrifying question of whether God, in His infinite wisdom, sometimes allows us to fall so utterly, so completely, that only a miracle can lift us back up. My thoughts, heavy with the Vance's anguish, were pulled back to the grim reality of the present moment. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed with a detached indifference, casting a stark, pale glow on everything, washing out the natural colors of hope, replacing them with the clinical pallor of despair. We were ushered into a small conference room, a functional space with a large monitor dominating one wall, a sterile table, and a few ergonomically designed chairs that offered little comfort. The air was cool, smelling faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, the ubiquitous aroma of institutional care. Dr. Anya Sharma, the lead neurologist, was already seated. Her demeanor was a carefully balanced blend of profound compassion and unwavering clinical finality. She was a woman of science, her expertise rooted in the tangible, the observable, the measurable. Yet, there was a gentleness in her eyes, a softness around the edges of her professional bearing that suggested she understood the human heart as well as the intricate pathways of the brain. She wasn't here to judge faith, but to lay bare the truth as seen through the lens of modern medicine. She recognized the fragility of hope, I thought, even if her profession demanded she confront it with unyielding facts. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, Father Michael, she began, her voice low and even, a counterpoint to the thrumming anxiety in the room. She gestured to the screen, where a series of complex medical images began to appear. They were vivid, almost artistic in their intricate detail, yet utterly terrifying in their implication. We've completed our final battery of tests, including repeated EEGs, blood flow studies, and reflex assessments. She clicked a remote, bringing up a cross-section of a human brain, then an overlay of activity. My eyes, though untrained, could grasp the devastating emptiness on the screen. It was like looking at a darkened city at night, expecting to see a galaxy of lights, but instead finding only blackness. The vibrant, pulsating energy that defines consciousness, thought, and life itself was conspicuously absent. This, Dr. Sharma explained, her pointer tracing the ghostly contours of Leo's brain, is a diffusion tensor image. It maps the white matter tracks, the highways of the brain that transmit signals. She paused, allowing the gravity of the image to sink in. As you can see, there's been catastrophic diffuse axonal injury. This means the connections, the very network that allows the brain to function, have been widely and irrevocably damaged. Think of it as every road and bridge in a major city being simultaneously destroyed. The infrastructure simply isn't there anymore. She then moved to an MRI scan, showing areas of significant edema, swelling, and hemorrhagic lesions. These are the results of the initial trauma. The impact was severe, causing immense shear forces within the skull. Following that, there was a period of anoxia, a lack of oxygen, which further compounded the damage. Her words were precise, each term a hammer blow against the fragile walls of Mark's hope. I watched Mark's face as Dr. Sharma continued, detailing the absence of brainstem reflexes. No response to pain, no gag reflex, pupils fixed and dilated. She showed us a video clip, a thermal imaging study that mapped the faint residual heat of brain activity. On a healthy brain, it would be a vibrant tapestry of reds and yellows. On Leo's, it was a chilling uniform blue, save for the faintest whisper of green where basic metabolic processes still clung to life, powered not by the brain but by the body's last desperate gasp for existence. The EEG results, she said, clicking to a new slide with jagged, chaotic lines that suddenly flattened into an unnerving straightness, show no electrical activity whatsoever, not even a whisper of a brainwave. We've repeated these tests multiple times over the last 72 hours, with no change. Her voice remained steady, but the weight of her words seemed to press down on the very air in the room. She looked directly at Mark, then at Sarah, her gaze unwavering. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, the medical definition of brain death is the complete and irreversible cessation of all brain function, including the brainstem. Based on all the clinical and diagnostic evidence we have gathered, Leo meets these criteria. There it was, the definitive statement, the scientific certainty that ripped through the thin fabric of Mark's desperate prayer. "The machine is breathing for him, Mr. and Mrs. Vance," she stated, her words leaving no room for interpretation, no hidden clauses, no medical caveats. "His heart is beating because his body is being maintained by advanced life support. But the central command system, the very essence of who he is gone. There is no path back from this. We are simply maintaining a body." The phrase, "simply maintaining a body," echoed in the sterile silence, a chilling pronouncement. It stripped away all the comforting euphemisms, all the hopeful medical jargon, and laid bare the grim truth. This was not a coma from which one might awaken. This was an irreversible cessation. Mark, who had been sitting rigidly, clutching his rosary so tightly his knuckles were white, flinched as if struck. A soft, guttural sound like a wounded animal escaped his lips. His eyes, already bloodshot from days of vigil, were wide with a terror that seemed to momentarily paralyze him. He shook his head slowly, a silent, desperate refusal to accept what his ears had just heard, what his eyes had just seen on the screen. He wanted to argue, to demand another test, another opinion, but the clinical finality in Dr. Sharma's voice, the sheer volume of evidence, had silenced even his fervent denial. He looked like a man watching his last hope disintegrate into dust before his very eyes. The rosary, once a symbol of his unwavering faith, now seemed to be a desperate anchor, failing to hold him against the rising tide of scientific certainty. He wasn't just losing his son, he was losing the very ground upon which his faith had stood in this particular battle. How could God allow such an absolute medical reality to crush a father's plea? Sarah, on the other hand, sat with a quiet, devastating resignation. Her shoulders, which had carried the immense burden of her initial request, seemed to slump slightly, not in relief, but in the sad validation of her worst fears. She had seen this coming, had perhaps even felt it in her maternal soul, long before the scans confirmed it. For her, Dr. Sharma's words, though brutal, offered a form of agonizing clarity. Her watery gaze was fixed on the screen, on the ghostly image of her son's brain, and then she lowered her head, a single tear tracking a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of surprise, but of profound, aching confirmation. The confirmation that the mercy she sought for Leo was not just an act of love, but an act aligned with the unyielding truth of his condition. The scientific certainty was a harsh comfort, a logical underpinning for the emotional decision she had already, in her heart, begun to make. It gave a name to the emptiness she had felt beside his bed. My own mind wrestled with the stark contrast between the world of faith and the world of medicine. As a priest, I am called to speak of mysteries, of a God whose ways are beyond human understanding, who can turn water into wine, who can raise the dead. But Dr. Sharma's presentation was not a mystery. It was a carefully articulated, evidence-based conclusion. Her charts and scans had clear, defined edges. They operated within the laws of physics and biology, laws that, in this instance, seemed to forbid any possibility of a natural recovery, let alone a miraculous one. I felt the familiar heavy mantle of my vocation. How do I comfort a parent whose child has been declared irreversibly gone by the most advanced instruments of human knowledge? How do I speak of hope when all earthly indicators point to absolute despair? The very foundation of what I offered, faith in the unseen, hope in the impossible, felt utterly out of step with the cold, hard data arrayed before us. I could see the chasm mentioned earlier, deepened now, solidified by the certainty of science. It wasn't just a matter of different perspectives. It was a matter of different realities, colliding in a small antiseptic room. My reflection for a moment turned inward. I had witnessed suffering throughout my priesthood, had held countless hands in hospices and hospital rooms, had murmured prayers over the dying. But there was something about this particular case. Leo's youth, the parents' fractured faith, and now this unassailable medical verdict that felt uniquely poignant. It was a test, not just for the Vances but for me, for the very tenets of my belief in a God who intervenes. Did I truly believe he could override such a comprehensive and definitive scientific conclusion? Or was I too subconsciously drawing boundaries around his omnipotence, accepting the limits that Dr. Sharma so meticulously outlined? Father? Dr. Sharma's gentle voice cut through my internal musings, her gaze turning to me, as if seeking an explanation from a realm beyond her expertise. I met her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible question she seemed to be asking. Dr. Sharma, I said, my voice softer than I intended, we understand your findings. We understand the prognosis. I chose my words carefully, wanting to affirm the rigorous work of science without conceding the entirety of spiritual possibility. You've been incredibly thorough and compassionate, she nodded, a flicker of appreciation in her eyes. My responsibility is to present the facts as unequivocally as possible, to allow for informed decisions. She didn't mention the word miracle, of course, but the unspoken challenge hung in the air. What could faith possibly offer against such an absolute truth? For Mark, the clinical certainty of Dr. Sharma was a cruel blow. He had clung to the idea that as long as the machines hummed, as long as Leo's heart beat, God still had a window, an opportunity. Now, that window had been slammed shut by medical science. It wasn't just hope for Leo's physical recovery that was being extinguished, but his very understanding of God's active presence in the face of such profound human helplessness. His God felt distant, silent, perhaps even absent from this sterile room where all the evidence pointed to an inescapable end. He looked at the doctor, then back at the blank screen, then down at his hands as if searching for an answer that defied logic, a scripture verse that could unravel the truth being presented. But there was only the cold, hard data. Sarah reached out, placing a trembling hand on Mark's arm, a gesture of shared sorrow, of a different kind of understanding. Her faith, though strained, had already begun the process of letting go, of seeking comfort in the release of suffering rather than its prolongation. The doctor's words, while devastating, confirmed the path she felt was true for Leo's sake. She saw it not as abandonment, but as a recognition of what was, and a merciful acceptance of God's will, however painful. Her pain was not in the what-if of science, but in the what-is of her son's condition. The room grew heavy with a suffocating silence, broken only by the distant rhythmic beep of unseen monitors, a sound that underscored the artificiality of life support. Dr. Sharma waited, allowing the information to settle, to take root in the Vances' hearts, knowing that what came next was not a medical decision, but a profound personal one, steeped in grief and belief. For me, the certainty of science was a stark reminder of humanity's limits, and perhaps of God's mysterious ways. It confirmed that Leo Vance, by all medical definitions, was gone. And yet, the core of my faith insists that God is not limited by human definitions, nor by scientific parameters. It was a dangerous, almost hubristic thought in that clinical setting. But what else was there to offer when the world of medicine, in its profound compassion and formidable expertise, could offer no more? This certainty wasn't just a medical diagnosis, it was the ultimate setup. For anything to happen now, anything beyond the inevitable decline, it would have to be an act of sheer, unadulterated divine intervention. It would have to be a tearing of the very fabric of the world as we understood it, a defiant whisper of grace against the loudest, most definitive roar of scientific fact. The chasm was not just wide, it was, by all human accounts, impassable, and it was across this very chasm that a miracle would have to fly. The certainty of science, as Dr. Sharma had so eloquently and unequivocally laid out, was a cold, hard fact that pressed in on us like the very walls of Leo's small, curtained-off room. It was a truth delivered with compassion, yes, but a truth nonetheless. Leo, in the medical sense, was gone. And yet, the core of my faith insists that God is not limited by human definitions, nor by scientific parameters. It was a dangerous, almost hubristic thought in that clinical setting. But what else was there to offer when the world of medicine, in its profound compassion and formidable expertise, could offer no more? This certainty wasn't just a medical diagnosis, it was the ultimate setup. For anything to happen now, anything beyond the inevitable decline, it would have to be an act of sheer, unadulterated divine intervention. It would have to be a tearing of the very fabric of the world as we understood it, a defiant whisper of grace against the loudest, most definitive roar of scientific fact. The chasm was not just wide, it was, by all human accounts, impassable. And it was across this very chasm that a miracle would have to fly. But before any soaring, before any flight, there was the descent. A long, agonizing plummet into the depths of human despair. We returned to Leo's room, the air within it seeming thicker, heavier than before. The rhythmic whir and hiss of the ventilator, once a sound of life sustained, now felt like a cruel, monotonous mockery. Each beep of the heart monitor, each flicker of the green lines across the screen was merely a testament to the incredible efficacy of modern medicine, not to Leo's own vital spark. He lay there, utterly still, a pale imitation of the vibrant young man I remembered. The tubes and wires, once an intricate web of hope, now felt like the threads of a final, unraveling tapestry. Sarah sat beside his bed, her gaze fixed on her son's face, not seeing the tubes, not hearing the machines, but seeing, I imagine, the ghost of his childhood, the promise of his youth, the vibrant spirit that had once filled their home with laughter and occasional exasperating teenage angst. Her hand rested on his arm, a feather-light touch, as if fearing to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over him. Mark stood at the foot of the bed, his back to us, his shoulders hunched. He clutched his rosary so tightly that the white of his knuckles was almost luminous in the dim light. He was a man made of stone and defiance, and yet I could see the tremor in his hands, the slight hitch in his breathing. The quiet stretched, not a peaceful quiet, but one fraught with unspoken words, with years of shared history and current, unbearable conflict. I understood the chasm that lay between them too. It wasn't just the chasm between life and death for Leo. It was the widening rift between husband and wife, between two souls bound by love and faith, now pulled in opposing directions by an unimaginable grief. Sarah saw mercy, Mark saw betrayal. Sarah saw release, Mark saw abandonment, and in their eyes, I saw mirrored the torment of Job, the agonizing questions that plague any person of faith when confronted with such raw, unvarnished suffering. Why? And what now? After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice a low, raspy whisper that sounded as if it had been scraped from the very bottom of her soul. "Mark," she began, her eyes still on Leo, "you heard Dr. Sharma. There's nothing left." Her voice trembled, but there was an underlying current of weary resolve, a mother's terrible strength. "We're just keeping a body. His soul, Mark, his soul needs to be free." Mark didn't turn. He remained a rigid pillar, facing away from her, from me, from the painful truth she articulated. "No," he growled, the word a raw, guttural sound, filled with a primal grief and stubborn refusal. "No, as long as the heart beats, as long as the machine works, God can work. God will work." He finally spun around, his eyes blazing, not with anger, but with a desperate, wounded hope that felt like a challenge hurled directly at heaven. "You want to give up? You want to sign the papers? You want to kill our son, Sarah?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and brutal, severing the fragile threads of their common ground. Sarah recoiled as if struck, her hand flying to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. "Mark, how can you say that? How dare you?" Her own voice rose, thin and reedy with fresh pain. "This isn't about giving up on Leo. This is about loving him enough to let go. Don't you think I want him back? Don't you think I pray for a miracle every waking second? But this is not life. This is prolonging agony. His and ours." She gestured wildly to the array of machines, their incessant beeps and hums now seeming louder, more intrusive. "Look at him, Mark. Really look. The doctors are clear. There is no brain activity. He's not here. Not really. It's just wires and tubes. We're holding him prisoner to our own inability to accept God's will." Mark's face contorted, a kaleidoscope of pain, anger, and disbelief. He took a step towards her, his voice dropping to a fierce, trembling whisper. "God's will? And what do you know of God's will, Sarah? Are you so certain that His will is for us to unplug our child? For us to decide when a life ends? He gave us Leo. He gave us 20 years. And now you want to just erase it? Because it's hard for us?" He thumped his chest with a fist, the sound hollow in the sterile room. "My suffering, your suffering, it doesn't matter. What matters is Leo. And as long as there is breath, as long as there is a flicker, a pulse, there is hope. You can't tell me God is done with him." "And what if this is God's will, Mark?" Sarah shot back, her voice now dangerously calm, a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. "What if this suffering, this terrible, terrible choice, is precisely what God is asking of us? To trust Him, even when the path is unimaginable, to release our grip, to surrender our desires, to accept that sometimes the miracle is not in defying death, but in embracing the difficult path He sets before us?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of shared faith, now strained to a taut breaking point. They were both drawing on the same wellspring of belief, but interpreting its flow in radically different ways. One saw divine intervention as a mighty hand that snatches from the jaws of death. The other saw it in the quiet strength to accept what is, to trust in a larger, incomprehensible plan. I felt like an unwelcome intruder, witnessing the raw, visceral unraveling of their deepest convictions. My own heart ached for them. There was no right or wrong here, only two parents flailing in an ocean of grief, each trying desperately to grasp a lifeline. I remained silent, sensing that any intervention from me at that moment would be futile, perhaps even detrimental. They needed to wrestle with this themselves, to exhaust every last ounce of argument, of pain, until there was nothing left but the bare bones of their love and their broken faith. Mark paced the small perimeter of the room, his rosary still clutched tight, the beads digging into his palm. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his eyes darting from Leo's still form to Sarah's tear-streaked face, then to the floor, as if searching for an answer in the polished linoleum. He was a man cornered, his logical arguments exhausted, his spiritual conviction battered by the relentless truth of Dr. Sharma's words. The flickering flame of hope he clung to was being systematically extinguished by the cold winds of reality, leaving only the embers of a profound, shattering anguish. I can't, he whispered, the words barely audible, choked off by a sudden, ragged sob. He slumped into the chair beside Leo's bed, the same chair Sarah had vacated moments before. The fight, the defiance, the fierce, unyielding hope, all seemed to drain from him in an instant. His broad shoulders, which had carried the weight of his family, his business, his unwavering faith for so long, seemed to cave in. He buried his face in his hands, and the sound of his weeping, deep and guttural, filled the room, a sound more devastating than any shouted accusation. It was the sound of a man utterly broken, surrendering not just to his wife, but to the crushing inevitability of their shared tragedy. Sarah rushed to him, her own anger dissolving into a wave of renewed grief and compassion. She knelt beside his chair, wrapping her arms around his shaking frame, and they wept together, their tears mingling, cleansing, dissolving the anger and the accusations that had separated them. They were no longer adversaries, but two shipwrecked souls clinging to each other in the vast, cold sea of their loss. Finally, after the storm of their shared tears had subsided into quiet, exhausted sobs, Mark lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, but in them I saw a flicker of something new. Not hope, not yet, but a profound, weary resignation. He looked at Sarah, then at Leo, then back at his wife, and in a voice that was barely a whisper, a voice raw with the deepest pain a parent can know, he said, "All right, Sarah." He took a shuddering breath, the words costing him everything. All right. He repeated it, a confession, a prayer, a surrender. All right. The nurse, a kind woman named Maria who had been hovering solicitously in the background, witnessing the raw drama of the Vance family, stepped forward. Her movements were gentle, respectful. She carried a clipboard, the papers on it representing the culmination of this agonizing decision. My heart sank even as I recognized the necessity, the mercy in what they were about to do. This was the final, terrible act of love. As Maria began to speak, her voice soft, outlining the next steps, the procedure, I felt a strong, undeniable prompting within my own spirit. It was a subtle whisper, distinct from the clamor of my own thoughts, a quiet nudge from the Holy Spirit. This was the moment. The chasm was not just wide, it was now entirely open. I gently interrupted Maria, who paused, her eyes questioning. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," I began, my voice as calm and steady as I could make it, trying to infuse it with the peace that had settled upon my own heart. "If you would allow me, there's one last thing I'd like to do. One last prayer." They both looked at me, their faces etched with exhaustion, but also with a nascent curiosity, perhaps even a hint of desperation for any spiritual balm. "We've prayed for a miracle of healing for weeks now, haven't we?" I continued, my gaze moving between them. "We've asked God, pleaded with Him, even, perhaps, demanded of Him, and that's natural, that's human. But sometimes, when we ask for a miracle of doing, for God to change a situation, to restore what is broken, we forget that there is another kind of miracle, a miracle of being." I paused, letting my words sink in, watching their expressions, trying to gauge if they were with me. Mark looked confused, Sarah contemplative. "A miracle of being," I clarified, "is not about God changing His will to suit ours. It's about us aligning our will with His. It's about letting go. It's about pure, unadulterated surrender." I moved closer to Leo's bedside, placing my hand gently on his still, cool forehead. The clinical smell of the room, the faint scent of antiseptic and sterile linens, seemed to recede, replaced by a sense of sacred space. "We've fought, haven't we? Against the doctor's words, against the reality of the situation, even against each other." I looked at Mark, then at Sarah, offering a compassionate, understanding smile. "And that too is human. That's love, manifesting as a fierce refusal to let go. But there comes a point, doesn't there, when all our fighting, all our bargaining, all our pleading must cease. When we must, as Christ did in Gethsemane, simply say, "Not my will, but yours be done." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on my hand on Leo's forehead. Sarah nodded slowly, a tear tracing a path down her cheek, but this one seemed less of agony, more of understanding. "We won't pray for a miracle of physical healing now," I explained, choosing my words carefully. "That would feel to me like a demand, a bargaining chip in a game we cannot win. We've given our very best to that prayer. Instead, I ask that we offer a prayer of complete surrender, a prayer for peace, for acceptance of God's inscrutable will, for the strength to let go of our grip, to release our beloved Leo entirely into the mercy of God's hands." I looked at them, my heart aching with empathy, but also filled with a strange, quiet certainty. It is in our surrender, I believe, that God often finds the space to act in ways we could never have imagined, not necessarily to grant our desires, but to reveal His glory in ways that transcend our understanding. Mark looked at Sarah, and in her tearful gaze, he seemed to find a reflection of his own exhausted soul. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Yes, Father," he rasped, his voice still thick with emotion. "Yes, surrender." Sarah reached for his hand, clasping it tightly. "Please, Father," she whispered. I turned back to Leo, placing both my hands on his chest, above his heart, feeling the faint mechanical rise and fall that was not his own. "Join me," I invited, gesturing for them to place their hands on their son. Sarah gently laid her hand on Leo's other arm, her touch soft, reverent. Mark hesitated for a moment. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, he placed his hand on Leo's leg, a powerful, calloused hand that now trembled with vulnerability. We formed a small, sacred circle around the boy, a silent testament to a love that would never diminish, even in the face of this ultimate parting. The nurse, Maria, sensing the profound shift in the room, quietly stepped back, her own eyes moist. The whirring of the machines, the rhythmic beeps, seemed to fade into the background, becoming a distant hum. The sterile environment of the ICU room seemed to soften, to warm, imbued by the raw, humble faith gathered around the bed. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, and began to pray, not with pre-written words, but from the wellspring of my heart, guided by the Holy Spirit. "Almighty and all-merciful God," I began, my voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of our shared humanity and our desperate hope. "We stand before you now, not in demand, but in deepest humility. We come as parents, as a shepherd, as your children, utterly broken and exhausted. At the very edge of our understanding, at the very limit of our strength." I felt the warmth of my hands on Leo's chest, the palpable grief emanating from Mark and Sarah through their shared touch. "We have prayed for healing, Lord, for your divine intervention to restore Leo to us, and we know that nothing is impossible for you. But in this moment of profound pain, we choose to lay down our own desires, our own understanding, our own will. We surrender it all to you, O Lord." I felt a tremor pass through Mark's hand, a quiet sob from Sarah. "We accept, Father, that your ways are not our ways, and your thoughts are far above our thoughts. We acknowledge that your plan, though often inscrutable to our finite minds, is always good, always perfect, always rooted in a love that surpasses all understanding. We confess our limitations, our fears, our desperate desire to control what is ultimately in your hands alone." The air in the room felt thick, charged with emotion, yet also profoundly peaceful. It was as if, in their utter relinquishing, a space had been cleared, an empty vessel created, waiting to be filled. "We release Leo, our beloved son, brother, child of God, entirely into your most merciful and loving care. We do not understand this path, but we trust you, Lord. We trust your wisdom, your compassion, your ultimate purpose. We ask not for a specific outcome, but for peace in Leo's heart, wherever he may be, for peace in the hearts of Mark and Sarah as they walk through this valley of shadows, and for the grace to accept your will, whatever it may be." My voice, though still soft, gained a quiet strength, a conviction born of this shared act of faith. "We ask for the strength to let go, Lord, to loosen our grip, to untangle our hearts from the pain of what is, and to place Leo's eternal soul directly into your sacred embrace. We entrust him to you, Jesus, our good shepherd. Guide him home, enfold him in your everlasting love, and grant us, his family, the courage and the fortitude to bear this cross with faith, hope, and charity, knowing that even in the deepest darkness, your light will prevail. We pray all this in the most holy name of your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen," Mark whispered, his voice choked with emotion, but clearer, lighter somehow. "Amen," Sarah echoed, tears streaming freely now, but her face softened, a profound peace beginning to settle over her features. We stood there for a long moment, hands still resting on Leo, the silence in the room profound and sacred. It was not the silence of despair, but the quiet of a deep, radical surrender. In that moment the fight had ended. The pleas had ceased. There was only the quiet offering of a broken heart, laid bare before a loving God. The chasm remained, wide and impassable by human means. But now the Vance family had laid down their weapons, their maps, their very will at its edge. They had chosen to trust, not in their own strength, but in the unseen, unknowable grace of God. And in that ultimate act of letting go, something profound, something deeply mysterious, had shifted in the very atmosphere of that sterile, hopeful room. The stage was set, not for a medical procedure, but for an encounter with the divine on entirely new terms. The quiet offering of a broken heart, laid bare before a loving God. The chasm remained, wide and impassable by human means. But now, the Vance family had laid down their weapons, their maps, their very will at its edge. They had chosen to trust, not in their own strength, but in the unseen, unknowable grace of God. And in that ultimate act of letting go, something profound, something deeply mysterious had shifted in the very atmosphere of that sterile, hopeful room. The stage was set not for a medical procedure but for an encounter with the divine on entirely new terms. We stood there then, not in active prayer, but in a profound state of suspended animation. Each breath we took a testament to the life Leo could no longer live on his own. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, a stark clinical counterpoint to the sacred hush that had fallen. Dr. Sharma stood near the head of the bed, her face a mask of practiced neutrality, though I could sense a subtle tension in her jaw. Beside her, a nurse, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, watched with a quiet intensity. Mark and Sarah were on either side of Leo's bed, their hands still resting on his still form, their gazes fixed upon their son as if trying to memorize every contour of his beloved face one last time. I stood behind them, a sentinel witnessing the quiet drama of faith and humanity unfolding. The respiratory therapist, a young woman with kind, weary eyes, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She approached the complex tangle of tubes and wires that connected Leo to the whirring breathing machine beside his bed. Each click and whir of the ventilator had become the heartbeat of our vigil, a rhythmic, mechanical assurance that life, however tenuous, however artificial, persisted. Now, that rhythm was about to cease. Her hand, gloved and steady, reached for the main tube connecting Leo's airway to the machine. There was no hesitation, no outward sign of doubt. This was her duty, a final act of medical care. I watched her, my own breath held captive in my chest, and reflected on the strange choreography of this moment. A team of highly trained professionals, equipped with every tool of modern science, was about to perform the ultimate act of surrender to the unknown. They were ending a life, not out of malice or neglect, but out of a profound and somber respect for a truth that their instruments had laid bare, that Leo's body was a vessel without a navigator. And yet, we had just laid bare our souls too, acknowledging a different truth, that some mysteries lie beyond the scalpels and the scans. The therapist looked at Dr. Sharma, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Then, with a soft, almost reverent motion, she disconnected the ventilator tube from Leo's tracheostomy. The sound, or rather the absence of it, was deafening. The rhythmic hiss and whoosh of the machine, which had been the constant sterile backdrop to our grief for weeks, abruptly ceased. It was as if the very air had been sucked from the room, leaving behind a vacuum of sound, a chasm of silence that swallowed every other ambient noise. The distant rumble of gurneys, the hushed conversations from the corridor, the gentle beeping of other monitors in the ICU. All of it seemed to recede, leaving only the stark, unblinking presence of the heart monitor by Leo's bedside. Its green line continued its steady metronomic dance across the screen, a lone, stubborn pulse in a room suddenly devoid of its primary source of respiration. We all stood frozen, our eyes glued to Leo, or to the heart monitor, or to each other, searching for a sign, a flicker, anything. The seconds that followed were not merely seconds, they were vast, immeasurable chasms of time, stretching and distending, each one pregnant with 1,000 unspoken prayers, 1,000 unvoiced fears. My mind raced, grappling with the stark finality of it all. This was the moment. The oxygen levels would begin to plummet. The steady green line on the monitor would eventually falter, then flatline. This was what science predicted. This was what reason dictated. And yet, the prayer of surrender, whispered mere moments ago, echoed in the silent chambers of my heart, a profound, unsettling vibration. Had we truly let go? And if so, what did letting go truly mean in the face of such absolute, crushing certainty? Mark's jaw was clenched, his knuckles white where his hand rested on the bed rail. His eyes, though brimming with unshed tears, were resolute, fixed on Leo's chest. Sarah had buried her face in her hands, her body trembling with silent sobs. Dr. Sharma maintained her professional composure. But I saw a subtle softening around her eyes, a hint of human compassion beneath the clinical objectivity. The nurse beside her had tears tracking silently down her face, and I, the priest, stood there, a witness to the rawest form of human grief and the ultimate test of faith. I felt the profound weight of my calling, the inadequacy of words, and the boundless mystery of a God who operates not on our timelines or our understanding, but in the depths of his own infinite mercy. The heart monitor continued its steady beep, beep, beep. A stark reminder that Leo's heart, though his brain was gone, continued its autonomous work. But the lungs were silent. There was no rise and fall of his chest, no shallow gasp, no reflexive tremor, nothing. Just the slow, inexorable march of time towards the inevitable. My gaze swept over Leo's face. So young, so still, a boy caught in a silent struggle we could not comprehend. I imagined his soul, floating somewhere in the liminal space between worlds, poised for release. Then, it happened. It was almost imperceptible at first, a slight tremor, a faint, almost involuntary shudder that rippled through Leo's upper chest, beneath the hospital gown. My eyes, perhaps hypersensitive to any deviation in that profound stillness, caught it first. A flicker of movement where there should have been none. My heart lurched, a sudden violent beat against my ribs. Was it merely a muscle spasm? A residual reflex of a body clinging to life, even without the mind's command? Before I could process the thought, before I could dismiss it as a trick of the light or a symptom of my own desperate hope, it came again. A deeper, more pronounced tremor. And then, a sound. It was a soft, wet gurgle, followed by a faint, almost nascent cough. It was not the vigorous cough of a healthy man, but a fragile, struggling exhalation that seemed to drag itself up from the very depths of his being. A sound born of sheer, primal effort. It caught in his throat, a small, choked gasp, utterly out of place in the profound silence. And then, impossibly, Leo Vance took a breath. It was a deep, ragged, shuddering inhalation that defied every medical explanation, every scan, every pronouncement. His chest, which had been so utterly still, rose and fell in a profound, struggling gasp. It was not a smooth, even breath, but a raw, desperate inhalation, as if his very body had clawed its way back from the precipice, desperate for air. A gasp, a wet, desperate, glorious gasp. A gasp that was utterly, unequivocally impossible. The heart monitor, which had maintained its stoic rhythm through the silence, should have begun to shriek, registering the plunging oxygen levels that should have accompanied the cessation of ventilation. Instead, it continued its measured beat, the green line dancing across the screen with an almost insolent normalcy, utterly oblivious to the profound cosmic disruption that had just occurred. Leo Vance, a boy pronounced brain dead, a body sustained only by machines, had just taken a breath on his own. In the sudden, profound shock of that moment, the sterile hum of the hospital, the very fabric of scientific certainty, seemed to tear, revealing a glimpse into a mystery so vast, so undeniable, that it silenced us all. The silence that fell upon us then was unlike any I had ever known. It was not merely the absence of the ventilator's hiss, but a cessation of all sound, a kind of sacred hush that absorbed even the faint, distant rhythms of the ICU. The heart monitor, which in any other circumstance would have screamed a cacophony of alarms, instead maintained its measured beat, the green line undulating with an almost defiant serenity. It was a lie, a betrayal of all medical expectation, yet there it was, an unwavering testament to a pulse that should have faltered, to oxygen levels that should have plummeted. My eyes, along with Sarah's and Mark's, were fixed on the screen, waiting for the inevitable flatline, the frantic beeping. But it never came. Dr. Sharma, usually a paragon of composure, stood utterly transfixed. Her mouth, which had been gently curved in professional empathy, now hung slightly open, a silent O of disbelief. I saw the struggle on her face, the furious, frantic re-evaluation occurring behind her eyes. Every neuron, every learned principle of medicine, every scan, every diagnosis was likely warring with the impossible reality unfolding before her. She was a woman of science, grounded in empirical truth, and the ground beneath her had just violently shifted. The nurse, a kind woman whose hands were always ready to offer comfort or assist, had brought them up to her face, fingers splayed over her lips as if to stifle a cry, or perhaps to simply hold in the astonishment that threatened to burst forth. She was weeping silently, her shoulders trembling, a quiet testimony to the shattering of the mundane. Then, it happened again. Another tremor in Leo's chest, a faint ripple beneath the thin hospital gown. And another. This time, a deeper, more resonant inhalation, a sound that filled the impossibly quiet room, a sound of life asserting itself. It was ragged, certainly, imperfect, but undeniably his own. And then a third, a fourth. each breath a tiny hammer blow against the fortress of scientific certainty, each an affirmation of something utterly beyond human understanding. The silence, however, was not confined to our immediate space. Like a ripple in a still pond, the news, or perhaps the sheer inexplicable energy of the event, seemed to spread through the intensive care unit. Nurses paused mid-step, doctors turned from their charts, visitors ceased their hushed conversations. One by one, they sensed it, that profound, unbidden stillness. Heads turned towards our curtained cubicle, drawn by an invisible current. The collective hum of the ICU, that symphony of beeps and whispers, slowly faded, replaced by an anticipatory silence, a shared breath held. They did not know what had happened, but they knew something extraordinary was happening. Sarah Vance, who had stood like a stoic statue through weeks of unimaginable grief, now crumbled. It was not a collapse of despair, but of raw, untamed, profound shock. A guttural sob tore from her throat, not of sorrow, but of something so potent, so terrifyingly joyful, that it seemed to wrench her very soul. Her knees buckled, and she fell into Mark's arms, who himself was already sinking. He slid to the floor beside Leo's bed, not in protest or despair, but in an act of utter prostration, his face buried deep in the cool hospital sheets, his body racked with silent tremors. I saw the rosary beads, still clutched in his hand, pressing into the fabric. The "why me" had been replaced by an awestruck "thank you," a silent scream of gratitude that transcended all language. He was not just witnessing a miracle, he was bathed in its blinding light. In that moment, standing amongst them, a priest, a witness, a man of faith, I felt a presence in the room that was so powerful, so absolute, it was as if the very veil between heaven and earth had been torn away. It was not a physical sensation, not a voice, but an undeniable weight in the air, a warmth that settled upon my soul, a clarity that resonated deep within my bones. This was no medical anomaly, no freak occurrence that would later be debated in scientific journals. This was a direct, undeniable, and holy response to a prayer of complete surrender. It was the whisper of God's mercy in the sterile heart of human suffering. We had asked not for a miracle, not demanded healing, but simply laid Leo, our hopes, our fears, our very definitions of life and death, at the foot of the cross, entrusting all to God's inscrutable will. We had let go. And in that ultimate act of letting go, of acknowledging our utter powerlessness, God had reached down. He had not just responded, he had intervened, with a breath that defied every human expectation, every scientific pronouncement. It was a holy defiance, a sacred overturning of what we believed to be fixed and final. This was not a reward for perfect faith, but a revelation offered in our most broken, most vulnerable moment, a moment when all human striving had ceased, and only divine love remained. The impossible had just happened, and it turned the entire ICU silent in a profound, reverent awe that echoed the silence of Gethsemane and the earth-shattering stillness of the empty tomb. Months later, the harsh, fluorescent glow of the ICU seemed a distant, half-forgotten dream. I sat with the Vance family not in a sterile conference room, but in their sunlit living room, the scent of fresh-baked bread replacing antiseptic, the gentle hum of everyday life, a balm to the soul after the relentless beeping of machines. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a testament to the quiet, persistent rhythm of time moving on. Leo was there, seated on the sofa, a thick woolen blanket draped over his legs. He was not the same boy who had hurtled down a road in a fit of youthful recklessness. The journey back had been long and arduous, a winding path of physical therapy, speech therapy, and moments of deep, frustrating silence. His movements were still deliberate, his speech slow and sometimes searching, but he was alive. He was aware, and in a way that truly mattered, his soul was awake for the first time in years, clear-eyed and remarkably present. I remember. A warmth, Father Michael, Leo spoke, his voice softer now, more thoughtful than the boisterous tone of his youth. His eyes, once clouded by rebellion, held a deep, unburdened peace, not a heat, but a warmth, like being held, and a quiet, so quiet but full, like everything was all right, even in the dark. He paused, searching for the right words. Then a light, not bright, not blinding, just knowing, and then a breath, my breath. It pulled me back. Sarah, seated beside him, reached for his hand, her face etched with residual worry but now alight with an enduring, profound gratitude. Mark, across from them, simply nodded, his rosary beads no longer clutched in frantic desperation, but resting gently on the coffee table, a symbol of quiet, renewed devotion. The miracle was not just that Leo breathed again, but that it had breathed new life into their fractured family, into their strained and weary faith. The anger, the guilt, the agonizing what-ifs that had choked their home like weeds had begun to recede, replaced by the tenacious, tender shoots of hope and forgiveness. I remembered a conversation I'd had with Dr. Sharma a few weeks after Leo was transferred out of the ICU. We were in the hospital cafeteria, the clatter of trays a stark contrast to the sacred silence we had shared at Leo's bedside. She was stirring her coffee, her gaze distant, fixed on some unseen point. "Father," she had said, her voice barely a whisper, "I've reviewed the scans, the charts, every single data point. There is no medical explanation, none. The brain activity we registered, after. He took that breath. It shouldn't have been there, not after what we saw before. It defied every parameter, every diagnostic certainty I've spent my life studying." She looked at me then. Her eyes, usually so sharp and clinical, now held a bewildered awe. "I can't account for it, Father. Not with science." She took a slow sip of her coffee, her expression softening. "And I can no longer deny that there are forces at play, beyond the charts and the scans, beyond the very limits of what we understand." Her words were a confirmation, a testament from the very bastion of reason, that what we had witnessed was not a fluke, not an anomaly, but a deliberate act. It was a truth that resonated deeply within my own heart. God does not perform miracles to be understood, I reflected then, and I reflect still, but to be witnessed. They are not a reward for perfect faith, for indeed, the Vances had been a family on the brink of despair. They are a gift, offered to us in our most broken, most vulnerable moments, when our human striving has ceased, when we have surrendered completely, and only divine love remains. The story of Leo Vance taught me that faith is not a shield against suffering, but a compass through it. It taught me that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not to demand, but to let go, to release our grip on what we believe should be, and to trust in the boundless, often mysterious grace of what is. For in that ultimate act of surrender, when we finally, truly let go, we discover that He holds on. He always holds on. And in the impossible breath that turned an entire ICU silent, in the quiet unfolding of a life given back, we are reminded, with a powerful, undeniable clarity, that His love is deeper than any darkness, and His mercy, more expansive than any human comprehension. It is a mystery to be lived, not solved, a truth to be embraced, not explained, and a hope that shines eternally even in the deepest shadows.